Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to all the participants and our today's speaker, Mr. Tariq Kamar Sahab. I just brief introduce the topic of today webinar is risk assessment for food safety, and our today's speaker is Mr. Tariq Kamar. He has diversified experience of about 27 years in the industry training and certification. During his industrial career, he remained the part of the bread, beverage, dairy, hospitality sector. He is still serving the profession as a trainer at national and international level. Mr. Tariq Kamar is a certified trainer of lead auditor courses for food professionals. He has remained the trainer of multiple organizations, including Nestle, Angro, PepsiCo, Kershi, USAID, Ministry of Science and Technology. Sir, kindly start your presentation. Thank you, sir.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, thanks to organizer to invite for this and arrange this training course. Only one thing which I would like to add before start of this training. If anybody has a question, there is a question box. You can write over here, and once we finish this training, then Dr. Shahid Saab will share the question of every participant, and I will try to answer those questions. So once again, thank you very much, Dr. Shahid Saab, for this opportunity to share this topic with the relevant peoples. Just a very small introduction of Bureau Veritas. Bureau Veritas is a French company established back in 1828. In Pakistan, we are from 1997. We are in a business of TIC industry, which is testing, inspection, and certification. We are the leader in food industry in Pakistan as well as around the globe. The topic, as Dr. Saab said, is the risk assessment for food safety. Actually, this topic is really a very important topic, keeping in view that if somebody is talking for food safety, they are designing or implementing a food safety system without risk assessment, that system is not a perfect system, because the risk assessment is the backbone for any food safety. The definition of food safety, I'm sure everyone knows that the food which consumed by the consumer shouldn't have any adverse effect to the health of the consumer. So it means the food where it provides the energy and nutritional value to the consumer, if it is not being handled properly, they may have many risks. So to produce a safe food, we need to be focused to the risk of associated with that food. And the risk, when we say risk associated with that food, it means we need to see which food category we are talking about, which premises we are talking about, infrastructure, work environments, suppliers, technology. So these all basically important for the risk assessment. If these are taken care very well, the chances of the risk is very low, or we can mitigate those. But if these are not being handled properly during the manufacturing of the food, then there can be a very risk from a small headache to till death of the consumer. So the risk assessment is a backbone for any food safety system. Like, take an example, not even for the food safety, we all taking a risk assessment all the time. Like, take an example, if we are going to plug something in for the electricity, we take a risk that we put on that plug into the electrical port, and there is also a risk. Similarly, when we are crossing a road, there is a risk. The only thing which we can add is we need to see the severity of that risk as well as exposure of that risk to that person. Like, some people are very afraid from feeling fear to cross the road. For them, the risk is very high for crossing the road. Similarly, when we say that in a food industry, if we are not taking care from raw material to end product, the risk and the exposure of the risk to that area, that will be basically can create a safe food to unsafe food. Like in your front, there will be a two picture. One is the lion and other one is the cat. Which one has the highest risk? That's very important for this area. The reason being, the risk for the lion is definitely a very high. But you see at the other way, maybe you will see or you will face the lion once in your life, maybe, but for cat, maybe you have a daily exposure. So the most risk is with cat. Why? A lion may be a dangerous animal, but the chance of coming across is very low, while kitten is small and apparently harmless because it's pet as well, but can cause injuries through tripping and severe asthma. So, but the exposure to kitten is very high as comparative to lion. The purpose to share this slide is we are not for risk assessment. Somebody is only focused to the severity of that risk to the health of the consumer. But it's a combination. For exposure, for severity, we need to also correlate with the occurrence of that hazard, because the combination of the both lead to the risk category. So we need to basically taken care for the both areas. Maybe sometime it is highly hazard but low exposure, and sometime it is low hazard but high exposure. So that both can tell you the categorization of the any risk associated with the. There are different definitions of the risk assessment, like Codex Alimentarius, where FAO and WHO, they defined very well the risk assessment definition. It's a scientifically based process, which basically have four areas. Hazard identification means hazard, which is anything which is harm to consumer, is hazard, maybe the biological, physical, and chemical. So when we are going to perform a risk assessment, we need to see that what sort of the hazards are associated with my product from farm to fork. And here I would like to add one more important thing. Generally, when food industry perform the risk assessment, they only perform the risk assessment from the any raw material which comes at their site and the end product which dispatched from their site. So they considered only those risks for their any risk assessment or any HACCP study. But ideally, the risk assessment should be farm to fork. Why? Because you need to analyze, you need to identify what sort of the risk or hazard coming from the raw material, chemicals, peoples, transportation, logistics, everything. And what sort of the hazards can be by the consumer if he will misuse the product or if he will not properly store the product. So we need to basically perform the hazards from input from to the output, maybe the from primary production till the consumption. So that is basically, and we need to identify the hazards associated with the supply chain, associated with the raw material. Those are basically linked with our product. Like if we are performing the risk assessment for UHT milk or pasteurized milk, then we need to see what hazards can be come from the raw material, like raw milk, like any stabilizer which we are using, any packaging material, and then so on till the that UHT pack goes to the consumer. So we need to identify each step, each hazard, biological, physical, and chemical. Once we've done it, the risk assessment tells us that it should be the occurrence and the severity, which tell us the hazard categorization. So we need to categorize them in a shape of maybe significant and non-significant, and the exposure assessment, how long it will be there, how long the consumer can expose to that hazard, that is very important. So it should be a very systematic, and it should be followed by a very sequence way. Some people they use the backward approach. What they do, they identify the control measures or the CCPs for the product, and they back calculate the risk associated with those CCP, which is a wrong approach. We need to follow first what are the raw materials and end products we have, what are the consumers we have, and then we need to identify for each area what hazards can identify. Remember, each step can introduce the hazard, can enhance the hazard, can control the hazard. So that's our risk assessment should tell what is basically the hazards at that step, whether that step is controlling, whether that step is enhancing, or whether that step is introducing that hazard. So it's a systematic approach. It's not like we do and we perform immediately. It should be like the people, those perform the risk assessment should be a very competent people. They should know the hazards, they should know the risk assessment methodology. So that's the definition of the codex. Then the hazards which ultimately converted into the risk is biological, chemical, and physical, contributing to the food, having a potential to cause adverse health effect. So our food is safe when there is either no adverse effect to the consumer or any hazard should be at acceptable level. The UK, the Global Food Safety Standards, BRC, it defines hazard as an agent of any type with the potential to cause harm, maybe the biological, physical, and chemical. Codex, the identification of the biological, chemical. When we say, you see, HACCP, we took HACCP like just to identify the hazard. But if you see the first H and A, they have a very, very significant meaning for hazard analysis. In the first H, it's identification of the biological hazard, like biological, chemical, and physical hazard. You just write the name of that hazard. And some people, when they identify this hazard, they only put the biological, chemical, and physical. The best hazard identification is what we are talking about in the biological. Is that the salmonella? Is that the E. coli? Is that some other clostridium? In chemical, what we are talking about for the chemical hazard is a cleaning agent. It's a pesticides residue. Is it aflatoxins or some other? So that is basically the physical. It is stone, metal piece, and so on. So we need to write the name of that hazard which we are talking about and which are being introduced through raw material, through our practices, through our machine, through our PRPs, etc., etc. And we need to focus to our product. When we say hazard characterization, it's basically a qualitative or quantitative evaluation. Qualitative means you just say yes or no. But quantitative, you have some data with you and you can put the numbers to perform the risk assessment. And that numbers tell you that how much it occurs, how many times it occurs in your process line, and what was the adverse effect to the consumer, and what can be an adverse effect. It may be the food poisoning or it may be some other effect. So these both combination that tell you that. There are a few other terminology used in the risk assessment. Like we always say that we need to identify the intended purpose of our product before performing risk assessment. Why it is important? Because it depends on your product. Is that product is for general public, for some specific age group, or it is for the people, those are vulnerable. Vulnerable people are those have the weakness in their system, and those are very susceptible to that hazard. Consequently, the effect, result, outcome from something occur, that what will happen if they have taken that food, maybe that consequences in result of the diarrhea, they may be in result of the food poisoning, etc. Then severity, impact, degree of the something. Sometimes it's impact very low, and sometimes it's impact very high. And likelihood is some event would be occur, like you can say it is basically the occurrence data. Sometimes we take this in risk assessment, the likelihood we took very likely this parameter, but we need to be very focused on this parameter because it tells your existing control. Like if you put for every hazard, you put likelihood as a maximum, it means your existing control is very poor. But if you take some data, if you visit the existing condition of that area where you are going to perform the risk assessment, then that likelihood will be supported by some evidence. Then it will be a like a perfect risk assessment when where you will be combined likelihood as well as the severity. And the very simply, the global standard define the risk, likelihood of occurrence of a harm from a hazard. That is the risk terminology. Then there are two main areas: exposure and control measure. Exposure, how much person or how many people could be exposed to that hazard, to that risk, and the control measure, any action which undertaken either to eliminate or mitigate against the risk. Remember, you cannot eliminate all risk. So you need to be make them at least acceptable level. At the acceptable level, where you will get from the regulations. The acceptable, you can put it from the Codex Alimentarius. It can be it vary from sometime country to country. So if we summarize this, there are three areas: risk analysis, risk management, and risk communication. When we say risk analysis, it's basically the assessment. Means you perform occurrence and severity, and on the basis of that occurrence and severity, you identify that your risk is towards a significant or non-significant. Once you determine that significancy of the hazards, you need to identify how you will manage it, how you will avoid it, how you will control it. So your control measure basically a part of your risk management, that the risk to the consumer should be minimum. And then lastly, you need to communicate with your internal team. You need to communicate with the regulatory bodies. You need to communicate with the customer, and you need to communicate these risk assessment through advertisement or through labeling of your product, so that the people should take a proper control to avoid such type of the risk to the consumer. What are the common application where we can perform the risk assessment? In that area, the risk assessment most favorable or most important is food. Any food which comes directly to the consumer, the risk assessment is mandatory. And there are many indirectly things which are associated with the food, but we should also take care of that during our risk assessment, like the packaging material which is being used for the packaging of the food. That is very important to perform the risk assessment. Consumer products, even nowadays, the apparels, the shampoo, soaps, and many other things also involve the risk assessment to have there should be no allergy to the consumer. Systems risk assessment is also that if our system is very good, very mature, then the risk level is very low. But if our system is new and people are not trained to that system, then our risk assessment is towards higher side. What risk can become from the equipment? We need to see the equipment engineering. We need to see the equipment hygiene conditions. We need to see the equipment design, that whether if there is a possibility that any hazard can come from the risk assessment. Then software, sometime our validation of the software which are being used for the control measures for the CCP. So that needs to be also can create some risk. Designing phase, definitely when we are designing our product at the R&D, research and development, we need not only focus to finalize the recipe, we also focus to perform the risk assessment from during the research and development. Engineering is again nowadays the term, maybe you people are familiar with the engineering is like hygiene engineering, that whenever we are designing some equipment, those are being used for the food, so that should be properly hygienically fit for that purpose. Health and safety, again a part where the people that involved, so that's again a risk assessment is also involved for the health and safety. Project based as well as the military, they can also use a risk assessment. So there are few terms which basically in the risk assessment comes. Hazard analysis, which I already explained. Sometimes you will find minimize the risk. It minimize the risk meaning that you should be able to have a risk within the acceptable level. So if you have a risk, so you need to mitigate it. You need to have a control measure to mitigate it. On the basis of risk, that is very important. Like Once we go for the food safety and even we perform the risk assessment, then a wish list start. Somebody says, in my company, every tap should be a sensor based tap. Somebody says, I must have a metal detector. Somebody says there should be a very sophisticated uniform. There should be a positive air pressure, etc., etc. The standards of the food safety, the risk assessment of the food safety requires that your control should be basis of the risk. It is not a wish list. Is it not that you make your system very highly cost is involved? So, but if you will go through the risk basis approach, that you will save the cost as well. So that's why if your risk assessment is proper, so your control measure will also be focused to that area. Then risk management, your procedures, your people, your equipment, your conditions, you need to be identify the risk management. Risk assessment is the exposure to the and the occurrence. And finally, you will rate your safety, keeping in view the risk. There are a few steps to basically risk assessment, to identify the hazards, to evaluate the risk, need of the control measure. You need to record the findings, and you need to update your system. So once you've done the risk assessment, it doesn't mean that it's the final risk assessment. Whenever you, like, I will give an example of China. There was an issue of the melamine. And till that time in Pakistan, no food industry takes, even multinational, they don't consider the melamine as a hazard. But once there was an incident in the China, and people's and the many children were expired, and that was because of that melamine hazard, which was used as a protein resource. So later on, everybody reviewed their standard, everybody reviewed their risk assessment, and they updated and they include the melamine in their risk. So means over here is risk assessment doesn't mean that you for your product you do it for only one time. That should be basically updated whenever you find any risk assessment, any risk associated. So first step, identify the risk. For that, you need to assemble a risk assessment team. That should be a knowledgeable team. That should be a multidisciplinary team, because one person cannot expert of all risk, because you have to identify the risk associated with the raw material. You have to risk associated with the people, risk associated with the equipment, risk associated with the layout, risk associated with the pest management, risk associated with the production. So you must have a team, those are a competent team, and you need to give them the assignment to perform a good risk assessment. The team needs to review the published information. It means they must have some data, maybe some scientific literature, maybe some published material, maybe some regulatory website where they mention the risk. Then guidance from the sources and association, trade association. So before doing that, you need to have a very good homework for the risk assessment. Otherwise, that you have a system in place, but you missed many risks. And after reviewing all this, the team should develop a potential hazard relevant to the product which is being under hazard study. Like if you even try to be a team approach, you go for the making a cup of tea, that also required many hazards, like the hazards coming from the water, the hazards coming from the tea, the hazards coming from the milk, then hazards of that kitchen, the environment of that kitchen, which contributing the hazard to the cup of tea itself. The cup, it can be a hazard. Then putting to the serving to the person is again what are the hazards associated with those. So it's basically in our every type of the product we need to perform that hazard. Multidisciplinary team, you need to from the management, technical, production, design, quality, engineering. So that is all part of your team. Risk assessment, you take a data from the supplier for the likelihood of the occurrence. You take a data from your product sheet, from the equipment failure, from your customer complaints, from your internal non-conformities logs. Implies can contribute to the likelihood of the hazards. Government sources and operational issues can tell you the risk assessment. Then once you hazard analysis perform, some people think that we only can perform the risk assessment when the production will be started. No. We even can perform the risk assessment when we are designing a product, because layout is a very important part for any food safety. If we will not perform the risk assessment during that layout, so maybe because of that poor layout, there can be a many risk can enter to your product. Now, once you have identified the potential hazard and risk associated with your product, your process, how we can estimate the level of the risk. So level of the risk is basically having the three main areas. The first one is severity to the consumer. It may be headache, it may be food poisoning, it may be irreversible reaction, it may be death of that consumer. Second part is the likelihood of occurrence. It should be from your data. How many times that hazard happened, occurred in your premises? And the lastly, detection. Do you have a facility to detect that hazard? So these three combination, whether through a numeric value, whether through your qualitative analysis, you can find out the level of the risk, keeping in view the occurrence, severity, and detection of that hazard. Some modules are the very simple, which is the qualitative and quantitative modules for the risk assessment. Some are quadrant graph, some are priority numbers. This risk priority number is basically also known as the Australian calculator for the risk. Then FMEA, failure mode effect analysis, that can be used for the risk assessment. And you may use a checklist as well to determine which area is a risk. Credible question can be, what are the all known hazards? So you must aware with the known hazard associated. Some people do the hazards keeping in view every hazard of the world they put in their risk assessment, which is wrong approach. You need to be identify the hazards, keeping in view your raw material, keeping in view your infrastructure, keeping in view your technology, keeping in view your end product and intended use of that product. Potential events involving the hazards, you need to take care of it. How that event was occurred, maybe some product recall, maybe some complaint, maybe some unsafe products, and how many times it was happened, and what happened after that, and how severe the consequences was. So you need to have some question whenever you are performing the risk assessment, keeping in view the occurrence and the severity. So you may have some examples, like you divide or make some likelihood as a methodology of the occurrence. You put it like rare, low, remote, very unlikely, so probably never occur, seldom occur but cannot be ruled out, unlikely, do not expect it, but it could be occur once per year, once per month can be a moderate level, a high once per a week, and month and daily basis may be the very likely. So either you can put these terms, rare, unlikely, possible, likely, or very likely, or you can put a numeric value, maybe 1 for the rare, 2 for the unlikely, 3 for the moderate, 4 for the high, and 5 for the very likely. Then this one was the occurrence, right? And now the severity. It may be that can cause death with that hazard if it goes with your product. It may be a irreversible reaction, which may be a very low recovery. It may be a illness require treatment in hospitalization. Minor can be, it can be some days to recover, and insignificant may be the self-medication. So you can also define the severity as per your, and you can give the number of numeric number like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And keeping in view these both, like we see the horizontal, there are the consequences, insignificant, minor, moderate, major, and severe. And in vertical, you can put the occurrence, which is certain, likely, possible, unlikely, and rare. Either you can do low, medium, high, and very high, extra high, or you can put the numerical value. And with this, you can make a methodology. When it is in the green column, it may be a low, you don't need to have any control. But when it may be in a medium, a yellow, you maybe have some hygiene activities. When it is a high and E, maybe you need a CCP. So that will tell you the control and the significance of the hazards. And sometimes also you can go for the numeric value, like you can have a minimum is 1 and maximum is 25. But again, it's very tricky over here. As a team member of the HACCP team, it's very important to understand that if you have a very unlikely and insignificant, that will be in the 1, but it is very unlikely, but the death occurs, it goes to the 5. But if it is insignificant and it is very likely, it go to the 5. So in both cases, the numeric value is the same. Like if your hazard comes very often, but it is insignificant, the result is 5. But if your hazard comes 1 in a 1 million, then it is death. So it means in that scenario, your food safety team should focus towards the severity, because even if it comes once a year or once in a million, so it should be controlled as a significant hazard, because the consequences are the death. Overview, you should also perform the microbial description of this problem in context of the microorganism, exposure, hazard characterization, and the risk categorization once you have a microbial hazard. Because the microbial is you need to detect it, you need to see the occurrence, and the effect may be like the Clostridium botulinum that may lead to the death as well. You may use the risk assessment checklist. Is the process likely to injure a person, damage the product, intended, fail in use? Yes, no will tell you the what actions you required. So that checklist can also be used as a tool. So these tools basically depend on your own methodology whenever you will use it. Once you determine the hazard identification, you determine the level of the hazards. The last step is basically to control appropriate, to make an effective food safety management system. So how you will control? First of all, you need to see the current control measures, existing control measures. Is they are capable to control the risk from a high significant to low significant? So that is basically, you need to analyze, your team need to analyze the existing control measure. If existing control measure, you can get rid of the hazards which you have identified, that's excellent. Otherwise, what will be the better control to the risk to occurs? And the lastly, less risky option, change of the supplier, new procedure, new equipment, metal detector, allergen handling, adherence. These are our control measures. But the main methodology which basically used is CCP decision tree. That CCP decision tree is basically 4 questions where they ask you. The first one is, do control measure exist? Because if you have a hazard there, you must have a control measure for food safety. Once you have a control measure there, the second one is that control measure capable to control the hazard, the prime function in your process line of that parameter of that step is to control that hazard. If that is yes, that will go to critical control point. Otherwise, that is not a critical control point. The third question is, there this hazard may be enhanced at that step? If yes, so that can be a you need to go for question number 4. The question number 4 is there any subsequent step to control the hazard? So that is again very important. If there is any subsequent step, that will be not a critical control point or any control measure to have a significant hazard to control. But if there is no subsequent step, then that step can be a CCP. In a control measure, you need to take the eliminate or reduce to an acceptable level, that hazard. That is a control measure. Like what is accepted as safe is not constant or absolute. So what exactly you required? The organization or society, sometimes you see some hazards level in Pakistan is a little bit acceptable level is towards a little bit higher side, but in Europe it is lower side. So it varies from regulatory requirement to regulatory requirement. Level of the risk when find acceptable. Standard may vary from industry to industry. Maybe the Nestle has a different standard and some local dairy has a different standard. And lastly, your standard and your control measure comes from the legislation or international standards. Control measure basically is a priority order that can be used to eliminate a hazard. So it can be, there can be a different sort of the control measures. like you at the end you perform the final product testing that tell you whether whatever controlled, whatever risk you identified and control you determine. So if your final product testing is in an acceptable level, so it means your controls are effective. Separation and isolation, that can be tell you the physical control. Positive release procedure can be a control measures. Training, instruction, and supervision can be a control measures. It's a preventive control that you train your peoples on hygienic conditions, on hazards, on critical control points, on other areas. Warning labels on products to avoid the potential mishandling by the consumer, to avoid to mention the vulnerable groups. Controlling risk at source is very important, which is we are not taking care during our risk assessment. During risk assessment, we also need to see from where that hazard is coming. Maybe sometime it is not at your premises, it is coming from your raw material, sometime from through the transportation. So that will be give you a sort of control measures where you can control. Substitution, sometime in a control measure you substitute with some other material or with some other equipment, and the priority should be eliminate that hazard. But if that is not possible, you need to put your hazard in an acceptable area. The hierarchy can be like this. You start with the training and instruction and the supervision, product warning labels. So that's the main control required by the different peoples, different organization. Then above this is the control risk at source, separate and isolate the risky and the non-risky product, safe working procedure, and the lastly should be elimination or substitution. So that should be the target, and that should be that we should eliminate those hazards. Nowadays there is again we call it hazard by design, that you design your system, you design your equipment, you design your premises, that instead that you control the hazard, you should eliminate the hazards. Sometimes there's a documentation risk assessment and review is required. You yourself act like an auditor all the time. So you need to see that how your risk assessment and control measures can be effective. So you should be expert. You should go in detail of the risk assessment methodology, review your system, update your system, and train your peoples on the update of the risk associated and the controls, and that to identify the evidences for them. And the most important thing, design your control measure on the basis of risk, not on the wish list, because that risk is basically we need to mitigate or we need to eliminate the risk. So our control measure should be on the basis of the risk which is highlighted during the risk assessment. When would you basically review the risk? Regularly. It's not one-time job, it's an ongoing activity. Your assessment and your review of the risk. Regularly review your risk. Whenever there is a change, whenever you receive any scientific information from literature, from subscriber, so you need to review your risk assessment. Whenever you have a new legislation in place, whether if you are selling your product locally or you are selling your product to that country, so you need to keep on eyes the updation of the legislation of the both countries, and keeping in view that change, you need to review your risk as well. Packing conditions, distribution changes, if it happens, you need to review your risk assessment as well. Whenever there is a raw material change by your R&D or your purchase department due to cost cutting, review your risk that because of the cost cutting, maybe there is introduction of the hazard as well. Equipment conditions and the storage condition changes, you need to review your risk assessment. Whenever there is a condition change or your product usage change, you need to review your risk assessment. Whenever your R&D modify your product, whenever you have a serious complaints from the consumer or customer, or you are selling to the different countries. So these are the basically 10 conditions as a minimum where you need to review and where you need to update your system, keeping in with the risk associated with all this. So this is from my side, an overview, a brief of the risk. Otherwise, there can be 2 to 3 days lecture on the risk assessment, keeping in with the different products. But that is the overview for the risk assessment. And now hand over to Dr. Shahid Saab if you want to ask any question.
Thank you, sir, for the brief presentation on the risk assessment for the food safety. So we received just only currently with two questions. That first one is BRCGS stands for what?
BRC is British Retail Consortium, and the GS is Global Standard.
Okay. So next one is from Amir Shahzad. Sir, how can we differentiate risk and hazard?
Basically, hazard is we are think the agent is basically biological, physical, or chemical, and risk is coming if our control is not poor. It's a probability of having that problem. The risk is that.
Okay. Next question is, although there are a lot of experts are there in our country and many advanced techniques are being used to control the risk, but still we are unable to ensure food safety systems. Please guide how can we control the risk in best way with minimum cost. Cost क्या कह रहा है कि हम किस तरह
The issue is that I will give you an example. There was a company who called me that our team is suggesting us, or our consultant is suggesting us, the metal detector. So when I came to know about their product, so there was no need of the metal detector. Only they need to have some sieve over there with the proper mesh size, and they convert, and the cost of the metal detector is very high, cost of the sieve is very low, so they can make a control measure to make the product safe with a low cost. So that's why the multidisciplinary team is very important. And the multidisciplinary team, there is another word which I use, a competent team. Those know that what is the risk and how the risk can contribute to the adverse effect to the consumer, and how we can develop a very effective control measures, keeping in view the cost effective as well. So that risk will tell you what control. But if we will not having a knowledge of that risk, then for me, I can a big wish list to have a control measures.
Next question is, sir, how we can differentiate risk and hazard if risk assessment at organization level and process level is same? Is risk assessment at organization level and process level is same?
You see, it depends on what we are doing. As I said, risk assessment is every part of the life. Even if we are crossing the road, there is a risk. Nowadays, organization level risk is the business continuity, and they perform that risk, that how in this, especially in COVID situation, how they continue their area. Process level depends that what sort of risk we are. If we are doing the risk assessment for food safety, definitely we go for the product wise. But if we are doing the risk assessment for health and safety, then definitely we will go for the people's, that how our employees can be safe. So it depends what is our basically the objective of that risk assessment.
Sir, can we reduce the risk in prepared food by any technique or any strategy?
Can we reduce the risk?
In prepared food, processed food, your final product by technique or any strategy?
It depends. Basically, again, मेरा ख्याल है, the people are not understanding that first we need to identify what sort of the risk it is. And definitely from that risk, we need to identify the control measure. Like the processed food, and if we have some packaging techniques, we can reduce the hazards. So it depends. That's why it's not a generic risk assessment. The risk assessment is basically a product line risk assessment from farm to fork. And during that, whatever the control we have, we need to correlate with our risk.
If anyone wants to ask question, then he can speak or type in the QA session.
Sir, please unmute.
Sir, kindly introduce about our different certification system, the leadership course to the participant. How can they participate in different courses, and how they will benefit in their career and their getting their foreign jobs?
Okay. Actually, first of all, we need to see how many standards we can apply in the food industry. If it is specific to food, we can go for the quality, environment, health and safety, BRC, FSSC, HACCP, ISO 22000, IFS, and Global Gap, and many others. One thing, if you want to make a career in this field, the lead auditor course are available for every scheme, and they can attend this. Generally, it's a 5 days course followed by a 2.5 hour exam. For the food safety, it is BRC. For the food safety, it is ISO 22000, FSSC. So these are the lead auditor courses which we can, which Bureau Veritas is running, and which we are doing. So if you are interested, so you can go for to attend this any course followed by an exam. But after attending the exam, it doesn't mean you will become the auditor. Then there is a protocol that you need to join with some certification body, either freelancer or permanent. You need to observe some audit. You need to perform some audit under the supervision of the senior, and finally your witness audit, and then you will be qualified as an auditor or a lead auditor. And you must have industrial experience. Like some students think that they will attend the lead auditor and they will go and qualify the auditing business. This is not. At least different standard has different schemes. Like FSSA requires 5-year industrial experience and so on. So this is basically the second. Other than lead auditor courses, like if you want to go to Middle East, they require HACCP level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, or food safety level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. So it depends what your qualification is and where you want to go. So that can be a basically level courses which also Bureau Veritas offer time to time. I hope answer is there.
Okay. For the fresh graduate, for a bachelor level, what are the courses they can adopt or they can get training?
That's for my point of view. They need to have a grip on the risk assessment with a detailed, extensive course on that. Secondly, HACCP level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, they need to be attend and pass the exam because that can be a good qualification either in shape of the food safety or in shape of the HACCP.
Okay. We have one more question. Can we include food safety risk at organization level risk assessment?
Yes, they can be do a integrated risk assessment. If you see, even nowadays all ISO standards, they are structurally the same. So that's preferred to have a organization level system for every, and you can add in the organization risk as well the food safety risk. But you need to be very much clear business continuity risk as well as the food safety risk.
Okay. Next question is, what is meant ISO?
International Organization for Standardization.
Okay. If anybody have any more questions, then type in QA bar or in the chat session. I think no more question from the participants. Okay. Thank you, sir. Tariq Kamar Sahab, for sparing some time. I will see one more question. That is, what is difference between CCP and PRP?
The PRP is a prerequisite program. Generally, it is called as the basic hygiene requirement. And the purpose of the PRP is to control occurrence of the hazard. PRP includes your layout, supplier control, pest management, personal hygiene, cross-contamination, utilities, waste management, etc., etc. So that's the basic hygiene requirement. And the CCP is a point. After that, there is no other point where you can control the hazard. So there is no subsequent. So that is called as a critical control point.
And what is the difference between CCP and OPRP?
OPRP is operational prerequisite program. As I said, the purpose of the PRP is to control occurrence of the hazard. So after implementing the hazard analysis, after implementing the PRPs, once you perform the risk assessment, if there are still occurrence of the risk over there, so you may, and because of the lack of implementation of the PRP, then you convert that PRP into OPRP to make it operational to control the hazard all the time. So that is called operational PRP, OPRP.
Okay. So I thank again Mr. Tariq Kamar Saab for the sparing time. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. My pleasure, sir. Thanks for invitation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.